Hello, I'm Moderator, and welcome to my second video in the series on EVE Online's Alliance Tournament 14, the $250,000 Major. In the first video I did, and I'll be linking this in the description of this video, as well as creating a playlist for all the videos in this series, I talked about the tournament as a whole and gave a general overview for why it's important and the effect it will have politically on the game as a whole. This video is going to be discussing some of the top teams from the last year that are returning, as well as some new arrivals that I think have potential coming into this year. For the interest of time, I'm only going to be discussing the top teams. I simply can't cover every alliance, and frankly, there's a lot of alliances I just don't know that much about. There's not a lot of footage on them, and for the interest of time, I'm going to keep it a bit shorter. So, the top 16 teams from Alliance Tournament 13 automatically get invited back to Alliance Tournament 14, and then the rest of the slots are then chosen randomly from the teams who entered, the random draw, and then teams who managed to bid their way in. However, 4 of those teams from Camel Empire, Warlords of the Deep, forfeited their seeding because of the match fixing scandal. Noli Secunda chose not to enter because their alliance disbanded, and Gorgon Empire had their tournament team move from that alliance to a combination of Vita Reloaded and the Afterlife, so they've chosen not to enter as well. This change in the bracket has created kind of a weird, strange mix of what's going to end up playing out in the lower end and some of the top end of the bracket, simply because when you have a shakeup of 3 of the 4 teams not re-entering who placed in the top 4, it changes the way the seeding works. So, in first place from last year, we have Pandemic Legion. They won last year's tournament outright. They've traditionally been very strong. They've won something like 4 or 5 Alliance tournaments. They're the most winning team that's still around. They've always been very strong in terms of their theory crafting and their metagaming, and they've got a strong core, I believe, as well this year, having picked up Casper and Blue Melon from Warlords of the Deep. I expect them to win the tournament outright. They have a pretty easy run of the winner's bracket, and I think that they should be pretty far and away the strongest team, historically at least, coming into this event. Exodus is also a team that is traditionally very strong. They're the second place from last year. They've always been a team that's been in kind of the top 3 to 8 roughly. They had a bit of a rebuilding year in XIV 2 years back, but they've had a very good run last year. A very close match against Noli Secunda, but then just not being able to quite match up against Warlords of the Deep and Camel Empire in the last year's tournament. The grudge match between them and Tuskers, who came 3rd and 4th, is going to be a very major storyline between who's better of those 2 small gang roaming alliances. Tuskers is a team that came in, I believe, 4th in AT12 and then 3rd and 4th in AT13. They're going to be looking to try to, along with Exodus, try to upset Pandemic Legion and knock them off of their throne. Hard Knocks came in 4th after the seeding changes from last year. Unfortunately for them, it's been a total of 15 months since the tournament ended last year, and they've lost their team captain to Tuskers, and they've lost a lot of their core members to Tuskers as well, or to inactivity. Unfortunately for them, they're a team that probably won't be making the final weekend of the event. Then in 5th place, we've got Shadow Cartel. Again, another case similar to the problem that Hard Knocks has with member retention. They've changed their time zone, so they've moved from a EU time zone core to a US time zone core. Wellbagger and Sakura from the team last year that made them successful simply aren't playing anymore. In AT13, they could have knocked out Pandemic Legion, actually, and this year I don't expect them to make the final weekend as well. Ronin, in 6th place, is a bit of a question mark. They were a team that infamously knocked out Hydra Reloaded in Alliance Tournament 12, I believe it was, and unfortunately, I think they've just decided to kind of leave on a high note. No one's really quite sure what their activity is going to be like and how many of their members will actually be returning. It's very difficult to get information on them, as none of their members really are active on Tranquility if you look on their kill board. Then you've got Triumvirate, who's seated in 7th place. Essentially, everyone who made that team particularly relevant last year has moved on to Volta, a team I expect will go very far. Triumvirate, however, still retains seeding number 7, and they're a team that I think can maybe place at best in somewhere between top 16 to top 12. Technical Narcotics team came in 8th last year, and they essentially anchored their way to top 8. They had possibly one of the easiest top 8 runs of any team ever in the Alliance tournament, and they're going to get knocked out almost certainly by Lumpy in round 1 of this year's event. I haven't seen much of them in practice, and unfortunately for them, they're a team that's not particularly tournament relevant. I don't even think they'll make it to top 24 overall. Test Alliance Please Ignore came in 9th last year, and they're a very good example of kind of a prototypical gatekeeper team. Chester jokingly referred to them as a kind of a low-tier team in the context of the very kind of endgame final boss teams, and I think there's some truth to that. If you can beat them, you're probably a top 16 team. Their team captain, Soldars, has worked with the team. They're very active. They practice very hard. They enter almost every event that they possibly can, including the Fight Club tournament run by XIV. They're better than most teams, and they have a very good, solid core in terms of activity, but I think they lack the endgame theory crafting to really break into the top level, or, as Chester would put it, tier. The Afterlife is a team from Russia that placed 10th last year, and they are comprised largely of former Darkside Alliance members and returning members from their AT-13 run. Unfortunately for them, some of their better players left to form Vita Reloaded, but I think they still have a solid enough core, especially with Faffy Waffy coming in, who was a team captain for Darkside that historically has done well in the past. And I think they could be a top 8 team or better. Last year they only lost to what is now Volta and Tusker, so they traditionally match up very well against anyone that's not a top 8 team. End of Life is another Russian kind of gatekeeper team. They're not quite as good as Afterlife or Vita Reloaded, another team I'm going to be covering. They generally have fairly solid play, but they have weird theory crafting where they get into this RU mindset, or they simply don't quite have the depth of theory crafting and setup pools that some of the North American and European teams have as well. Phoebe Freeport Republic came in 12th last year, and I'm really glad to see them enter and stay in the tournament, despite their alliance largely having broken up from losing Sav in the south of Eve. They had a pretty easy bracket this year. They're been practicing very hard, and I think that they're going to have a decent showing. They're a team I expect will retain their invite back into the upcoming Alliance tournament should they choose to take it. Now, for the new arrivals. I think at the top of the new arrivals, we've got Vita Reloaded. This is going to be Lucy Lou's group. Lucy Lou being the famous YouTuber, having recently beaten Mercenary Coalition with his Vargar. And then they've got Nika Noiser, who is one of the better Logipouts, I would say, overall in the game. So I think that core, having assembled from kind of these like Russian roaming all-stars, could be very good. They'll either be very explosive. They've also picked up some players from the Hydra Reloaded Russian core. And because of that, they have the player skill to challenge basically anyone in this event. They're either going to be a very explosive team, or they're just going to be lacking the experience and kind of depth that other teams would have as a result, and just kind of fade out in the top 8 to 12 as a result. We Form Volta is a group that is formerly what was the Tri-Team from last year that made top 8. They've also done a good job of recruiting some people from Theraboys and members of Verge of Collapse, I believe, that were in the Alliance Tournament 10 run when they won the event that year. Freegates is a team that was ex-Hun Reloaded / Noli Secunda, and unfortunately, they're largely dead as a tournament team. They have had a lot of their players go inactive, and this year they're going to be looking more to merely make the top 16 teams. NC Dot has some ex-Pandemic Legion members and some of the Nully players that have moved over when Nully broke up. I expect them to make either top 16 or top 5th or 6th, honestly, depending on where they place in the winners bracket. They're kind of a question mark because of all these new factors coming together, so it remains to be seen whether or not they'll really be able to form a solid core, or whether they'll kind of fizzle out and won't have the depth to make it as far as some of the other teams. Lumbee is a team where if you look on a Potney's guide, which I'm going to link in the description, and is on EveBet, is currently predicted to be in 3rd place overall. And I think that's really overestimating the team. Due to the seeding that they're in, they either will not make it past top 16 in the losers bracket, or they'll make top 5th or 6th. They have no actual Camel Empire players or Warlords of the Deep players coming to their team, with the exception of Leo Kokim, the Alliance commander and team captain. They have Rylode, the infamous maker of the excellent Z-Kill Guide series, but Rylode is a player who actually was never a member of the Camel Empire team. Unfortunately, he never actually made it to the final practice squad there. So I think that covers essentially all the teams that are notable. If you think there's anyone else I should have discussed, link it in the Reddit comments or in the discussion thread of this video. So going back all the way, I'm going to go back to Pandemic Legion and their run into the bracket here. So Pandemic Legion, you can see, goes up against Iron Armada and Seed Nullus, and then the Explicit Alliance. Then they go up against Northern Coalition. I expect them to win all those matches very handily. They don't have to show a lot of their setup pool, which will benefit them greatly going into the later matches. I think that Lumpy and NC Dot is going to be a toss-up, but PL beats either of those teams fairly handily. I don't see much of an upset potential. That would put them in a best of 3 against WeForm Volta, and I really don't see Volta taking more than one match off of Pandemic Legion. I don't think that Volta really has the depth of strategy in order to really beat Pandemic Legion. Pandemic Legion has gotten a lot better in terms of player skill as well, and I think that really just favors Pandemic Legion going all the way through the winners bracket and just winning the tournament outright. Then we've got Exodus in 2nd place. I really feel bad for them in the bracket that they have. Ministry of Inappropriate Footwork, unfortunately, is going to get rinsed by them, but Footwork is probably a solid top 24 team. Then they go up against Vidor Reloaded. And the loser of this match, as I was mentioning earlier, the seeding creates kind of these really weird brackets where Vidor Reloaded honestly deserves to have anywhere from a top 8 to a top 12 seeding at the very least. And because it's been a random draw as they're a new team, the loser of that match is going to just completely tear through the losers bracket. And unfortunately, I think that the loser of that matchup really is going to completely run out of steam and setup pool due to the fact that they have to go through so many matches, and as a result, when they get back towards the end of the losers bracket, whoever goes through is just going to end up, I think, eventually running out of steam and getting counterpicked. I then have either Exodus or Vidra beating CVA and then Afterlife, but eventually losing in a fairly close match, I believe, against Tuskers Co. Then in 3rd from last year, we've got Tuskers. They were the top 3 team, and unfortunately for Waffles, Waffles is going to get sent to the Shadow Realm fairly early for them. Rokapel and Castabout shouldn't have too much of a challenge for them, and I have Ronin as a placeholder team there. It could very well be either a combination of End of Life or Free Gates going up against them, but I don't see Tuskers having too much difficulty against either of those teams. And then I have Tuskers beating either Exodus or Vidra 2-1 in the semifinals winners bracket. So in 4th place from last year, we have Hard Knocks. Unfortunately for them, having lost most of their core, I think they win a fairly easy match against the official winners of Takeshi's Cashel. Quite a mouthful of a team name. And then Out of Sight. However, I think Volta is just too strong of a team for Hard Knocks, and as a result, I expect Hard Knocks to get knocked down to the lower bracket and do not nearly as well as their fourth place seeding would indicate that they would. Then in fifth place, same situation really as Hard Knocks as I discussed earlier. Shadow Cartel has lost most of their core. They could easily actually get upset by a band apart, but that would still be an upset. And then they'll pretty handily beat either Solar Fleet or Velour Accords. Phoebe Freeport and Shadow Cartel is honestly a bit of a toss-up. It's a 50-50 match. It could go either way, but either of those two teams will not beat Volta. They don't really stand too much of a chance against that roster. So moving on to sixth place, we have the Ronin. Ronin should beat RVB and could beat Freegates. That's a toss-up again, as I mentioned earlier. Unfortunately, I don't see them going too much further. I don't think they'll get anywhere near their sixth place showing from last year. Then in seventh, we've got Triumvirate. Again, they've got the placeholder seeding from last year's results, but their team went to Volta. They'll beat the Block and Brave Collective simply due to just having better player setups, and I think that they win fairly easy in any sort of a mirror matchup against either of those two teams. But they'll get beat by Afterlife fairly handily. That brings us to team number 8, which was Tactical Narcotics team. Again, Tactical Narcotics team's not really tournament relevant. Lumpy will beat them pretty handily, and unfortunately, I don't, again, see them making top 24, as I mentioned earlier. That brings us to seeding number 9, which would be... Who would that be? That would be Test Alliance, please ignore. They'll beat Scary Wormhole people fairly easily. I think their matchup between Northern Coalition will unfortunately be a loss for them, and that they'll have to grind through the lower bracket of that series as a result. Which brings us to 10th place, being the Afterlife. Afterlife will beat Tissue. Unfortunately, Tissue has largely disbanded. They've lost most of their corps to other entities. They'll beat Circulus 2 as well fairly handily, and then they'll beat Triumvirate, having the placeholder seeding from last year. But they should lose to Exodus or either Vidra. Then in 11th, we have End of Life. They could lose to Agony Empire, but I believe that would be an upset. They'll beat the winner of Pixels and Calcif fairly easily. And again, it could be a toss-up between End of Life and Ronin, or even Agony making it this far. More on that as I get to the lower bracket and discuss the teams there. Phoebe Freeport will beat their first 2 matches. I think that they've actually been practicing Snuffed Out traditionally, even though they've got some fairly decent pilots and they've got high skill point characters. They traditionally don't really put any effort into the tournament, and I think Phoebe Freeport gets carried that way. I believe that they beat Shadow Cartel as well, simply because they've been putting a lot of effort into the event as a whole. So, then again, Vita Reloaded, already discussed them and their run going up against Exodus, and I will link their lower bracket run in just a moment. So, Northern Coalition as well. NC Dot is going to beat White Legion. They should beat Test, and I think their matchup between them and Lumpy is going to be a bit of a coin flip. It could go either way, but either team is going to almost certainly lose to Pandemic Legion fairly handily. Then we've got Volta, who is going to beat Affirmative, Feign Disorder, and Hard Knocks without too much difficulty. I also see them beating Freeport, but they don't quite have the strength in order to come up against Pandemic Legion. So that would move them down to the lower bracket, and that really covers all the teams that I think have a chance of doing well in the upper bracket. Scrolling down to the lower bracket, there's a bit of a weird pool where the top half of this lower bracket, I believe, is much stronger than the lower half. I have Freegates here as a placeholder, but that could just as well be the Ronin as well. I have them beating out Fraternity, Tempest Calcif, and Shadow Cartel. I just think that even as a rebuilding team, they have more roster depth, and they still have the leadership of the Hun Reloaded team as well. Hard Knocks, I still think, even though they are not nearly as good of a team. They still are going to beat Rote Capel in their losers match, and they might beat Freegates, but they're going to probably lose to Afterlife, and instead of making a top 4 finish like they did last year, they're just going to kind of settle in as a kind of average top 14 to 12 team. Then unfortunately we have Lumpy, having lost to NC Dot in my placeholder match. Again, that could be a 50-50. I think either NC Dot or Lumpy loses to Vidra very easily. Vidra would have to then beat 404, Alliance Not Found, then Culture, and then Explicit Alliance. Again, none of these teams should pose much of a problem for them, but it will cause them a bit of fatigue. They'll have to show a lot of their setup pool, and I think that's going to cost them later in their lower bracket run. So then I've got End of Life, having lost to, I believe it was Tuskers in my bracket, and they should beat Ministry of Inappropriate Footwork and knock them out from getting the invite into next year's seeding. Out of sight in them is kind of a coin toss, but I have NC Dot winning something of a coin flip, but I think NC Dot has something of an edge on End of Life. Then here we've got Triumvirate and Test Alliance Please Ignore. I see Test Alliance really as being the team that will probably do the best in this lower bracket. They could either get anywhere between a top 16 finish, between them, Agony Empire, and Phoebe Freeport. I think those will all be very even matches, but no matter which of those 3 teams goes up against Northern Coalition, they'll lose to NC Dot. So we can see that depending on how the losers bracket goes between either Lumpy or NC, it's a massive difference between a 5th, 6th place finish and a top 16 finish. Unfortunately, that's just because the upper half of this lower bracket I believe to be much stronger. Then we move further to Vita Reloaded, having continued their climb through the lower bracket. I believe that Afterlife, having not shown as many setups, will have a bit of an advantage there, but I think that Vita Reloaded will simply outskill that team. Volta will be much more fresh and won't have anywhere near the issues with the setup pool that Vita will. At this point, Vita will have played something like, I want to say 8 or 9 matches. Volta will have played far fewer. And Vita, I expect to just get counterpicked at this point, even though I think it could be a coin toss either way. It could go either way in a mirror matchup, and I'm very excited to see that matchup. It'll be really entertaining to see those teams match up against each other. And really, this lower bracket has no really bad matches. All these matches going past the round of 16 are going to be very closely contested, with the exception, I believe, of Vita Reloaded storming through the lower bracket and NC Dot pushing out some of the lower end teams. So I expect either NC Dot or possibly Lumpy to get all the way up to Exodus. Even though it's a best of one and there's upset potential, I think Exodus is just way too strong of a team to lose to any of those entities. And then we have Exodus going up against either Vita or Volta. Exodus in a best of 3, I don't think loses to either team again. Vita would be completely out of setups at that point and probably very fatigued at that point. Volta is kind of a less established team. Exodus has picked up Wasa QC and others who won the Omar Succession tournament, and they picked up some talent from Chester's group, Wilderness, and I think that gives them more player skill and depth going into this event, and I believe that they would win in the 3rd and 4th place match against Volta. Tuskers Co. and Exodus is much of a coin toss, but I favor really whoever wins in the winners semis. This would be a rematch between Tuskers and Exodus. I think whoever has to show less of their hand, show less of their setup pool, and again is less fatigued, as is the case for most of these matches, honestly, past 5th and 6th place is going to be the winner. Kind of a curious case between Tuskers and Exodus. I think that both of these teams probably should have more aggressively recruited players from Camel and Warlords that were still interested in the event. With it being this close of a matchup and so much on the line this late in the tournament, I think that they really needed to bolster their roster, and I think not doing that is going to be costly for both of the teams. Really getting this late in the tournament is going to really be a showing of how well teams can react to what they see each other do, and is going to be a lot of counter picking, as well as who can field the Atana Alliance Tournament logistics, and Cambions and Fiends as well. It also probably comes down to who makes the least mistakes. Exodus famously lost against Camel Empire last year, largely because one of their Longshoreonic Assault frigates boundary violated, and I think going from a 12-player to a 10-player setup allows you to have a much stronger, solid core of players, and I think that's what's going to carry Exodus through this lower bracket. It remains to be seen who's going to be the better team of Tuskers and Exodus. I haven't been practicing this year, as I've been focusing all my time on getting ready for the tournament and casting the event, and I'm really excited to see that event. Unfortunately, I think that either team at this point is probably just going to lose to PL. PL would only have to win 2 of the 4 matches in that series, and they're going to have a lot more stamina. They won't have to have showed nearly as much of their hand, and I think that Pandemic Legion is ultimately going to be the winner of Alliance Tournament 14. If you stayed with me for the entirety of this video, thank you very much. Discuss what you liked about this video or didn't like, and I will then talk about the theory crafting and the meta, what we'll expect to see in this tournament in the third video. Thank you for watching.